Jeff mentioned that this session is all about sort of identifying the problems. I am not so much a person who is keen to identify problems. I'm really much more interested in trying to find some solutions. As you can see, the title Ecological Integrity as a Grundnorm of law and Anthropocene is claiming to be, laying some fundamental grounds for the challenges ahead. With that, I'm going to give you a presentation of some 15 minutes. I might cut short here and there. The thesis is fairly straightforward. It's basically trying to answer the question, what sustainability is. So as you can see, we start from scratch. What is sustainability? The argument is going to be sustainability is based on some fundamentals with regard to protecting the integrity of ecological systems, as I'm going to show first, and then later on how this concept of ecological integrity has been referred to in international law as well as in domestic law, and drawing some conclusions from there. So next, as you can see, we start from scratch. What is sustainability? The argument is going to be sustainability is based on some fundamentals with regard to protecting the integrity of ecological systems, as I'm going to show first, and then later on how this concept of ecological integrity has been referred to in international law as well as in domestic law, and drawing some conclusions from there. So next, you can see it gives you very little space to operate with. The next model would explain it even further. Yeah, next. Right, this is of course truly unsustainable, the famous Mickey Mouse model that describes the status quo, of course a totally overblown economic system with some little ears wagging around, making it a Mickey Mouse, but then we are heading for the real thing. Next, please. Next, this is the famous strong sustainability model. Of course, the only one that matters, and I call it true sustainable development for not wanting to confuse it with sustainable development per se. The trueness comes from the origins. It comes from the very discourse around sustainability, around the Brundtland Report and so forth. Next. Next. The long history of sustainability, very briefly, it's not being invented in the 1980s. It comes from many cultures, of course, indigenous cultures, non-Western cultures, but importantly, even within the European context, we have a lot of evidence about a sustainability culture preceding the modern industrial revolution. I'm just throwing some references at you here. Hans Carl von Carlowitz, the inventor of the term Nachhaltigkeit, which later became translated into sustainability. I do recommend the book by Ulrich Grober, A Cultural History of Sustainability, especially in the European context. Next. And of course, important to acknowledge the Club of Rome, which really juxtaposed sustainability with collapse. You find passages in the famous Club of Rome report saying that the antithesis to collapse is in fact sustainability, which gives you the background against the Brundtland Report next, when it was crafted in the mid-1980s. Now, this is an important first message next, that the Brundtland Report actually said a little bit more than just the famous definition then that you all are familiar with. Next. The very next sentence, next, gives us some clue. This definition contains within it two key concepts, the concepts of needs, in particular the essential needs of the world's poor, and the idea of limitations imposed by the state of technology and social organization on the environment's ability to meet present and future needs. Next. We find a lot of passages in the Brundtland Report that give us an important clue. For example, page 26. The Earth is one, but the world is not. We all depend on one biosphere for sustaining our lives. Next. On page 29, there are thresholds that cannot be crossed without endangering the basic integrity of the system. Today, we are close to many of these thresholds. Next. Sustainable development requires that the adverse impacts on the quality of air, water, and other natural elements are minimized as to sustain the ecosystem's overall integrity. So we get a lot of hints that clearly give us a message that the overarching ecological system is really the bottom line and not some compromise between economic, social, and environmental sustainability. Next. At a minimum, sustainable development must not endanger the natural systems that support life on Earth, the atmosphere, the waters, the soils, and the living beings. Here's your bottom lines. Next. I want to celebrate two famous Canadians. You will be well aware of them. I had the great pleasure to meet both of them. Sadly, we lost the two. Maurice Strong, of course, the former Secretary General of the 1992 Earth Summit. Jim McNeill, who was even more important in my book. I met him in the early 1980s. We followed some communication and then caught up many, many years later, in fact in Ottawa just 2 years ago. The point I want to make here is not only the incredible contribution to bringing the Brundtland Report to the fore in the first place, but giving us some really clear messages that the Brundtland Commission, certainly Jim McNeill and Maurice Strong, were always keen to define sustainable development as ecologically sustainable development. And again, the strong version and not the weak. A quote next from Jim McNeill in particular. In my class that I had the fortune to teach at Ottawa Law School a few years ago, he said this: governments and the corporate world cherry-picked elements of the sustainable development concept and rejected the idea to organize socio-economic development within the limits of nature, right? The report was suggesting just that, but press conference and follow-up from the Brundtland Report really didn't want to know about it. So ecological sustainability is paramount, according to Jim McNeill, who I consider the authority on the report as the lead author. It's important for us lawyers to be true to what really happened historically and not just give weight to what governments and corporations are telling us. Next. The role of environmental law, therefore, is clearly expressed, in my view, in pioneers such as Staffan Westerlund from the European environmental law early days, who in this passage he has once said, the central reference point of environmental law is not the environment or sustainable development, but ecological sustainability as an overarching objective. That's a clue, and that's where Elgar's philosophy, for example, comes in. We need to be true to the strong sustainability concept here in our context. Next. Another quote from an American friend, Sandy Gaines, in his highly recommendable article, Re-Imaging Environmental Law for the 21st Century. Quote, a reimagined environmental law should seek, so far as possible, to imbue all lawyers with a full appreciation that the sustainability of ecosystems of every scale and description should become one of the foundational principles of the law everywhere. Next. And another witness, Douglas Fisher from Australia, who wrote this wonderful book, Legal Reasoning in Environmental Law, which is a study of structure, form, and language, in particular with respect to how judges argue. So he analyzed court decisions from some four or five countries and also international environmental law decisions to find out that judges are really taking a rough view on what they are trying to say by protecting the environment. There's really a lack of being precise about what we are protecting, not the environment per se, but something more specific. So his conclusion on this very elaborate report, quoting here, processes of legal reasoning need to reflect the fundamental Grundnorms of the system, the rule of law in general and sustainability in the context of environmental governance. There you have the notion of Grundnorm for the first time. Next. So, conclusion so far, sustainability has its roots in maintaining the integrity of ecological systems that all life, including human life, depends on. It is the core idea behind the concept of sustainable development, therefore properly referred to as ecologically sustainable development, and has been described as central to the purpose and overall objective of environmental law. Next, giving you examples from international law treaties, or mostly soft law agreements, but also some treaties. Examples being the following. Next. Here, this is the objective of achieving sustainability described as preserving, restoring the integrity of the ecological system, contained in at least 25 international soft and hard law documents. Next. For example, this is from a 1978 US-Canadian Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, where we find the notion for the very first time, referring to the water system as having chemical, physical, and biological integrity. This was a benchmark document for many others to follow. So we very quickly go to some other examples, and you can hopefully read the key messages yourself. I'll just highlight a few things. Next. The World Charter for Nature has its inner general principles, the integrity of other systems. Next. Importantly, the Rio Declaration, both in its preamble, referring to the integrity of the global environmental and developmental system, but also in its operating principle 7, states shall cooperate in a spirit of global partnership to conserve and protect and restore the health and integrity of the Earth ecosystem. Next. Agenda 21 refers to ecological integrity no less than 12 times when I last counted it. These are just a few examples. So the very notion of defining sustainability as, the ability to maintain the integrity of ecological system has been paramount in those documents. Next. Of course, you would expect that the IUCN Draft International Covenant on Environment Development in its various amendments consistently refers to the integrity of the Earth's ecological systems, that they shall be maintained and, where necessary, restored. One of the key principles, next, a precautionary principle. Next. This is the mother of all, I like to think, the Earth Charter, referring to the integrity of Earth ecological systems as the operating principle. And there's no coincidence. It was Morris Strong, who I mentioned earlier, who referred to the Earth Charter as completing unfinished business, the unfinished part being states not wanting to go that next step, but they initially sort of wanted or had intended to go. Therefore, he always referred to the Earth Charter as his own creation, and rightly so. Many others followed him, but I again want to celebrate both Jim McNear and Morris Strong for having given us the right kind of frame of thinking that we as their descendants, so to speak, need to pursue further. Next. And more recent documents, even the weak document Rio +20 in Article 40 finally refers to the need to restore the health and integrity of the Earth's ecosystem. Next. You can even go to the Paris Agreement, so you find the language there as well. Next. Another example, the 2016 World Declaration on the Environmental Rule of Law, that the first World Congress on Environmental Law has adopted in April last year in Rio de Janeiro. Still a draft, but nevertheless compiling really the best of scholarship, arguably, from around the world to define really what the environmental rule of law is about. You can always argue there have been compromises. I wasn't 100% happy with the World Declaration, but there you go. Better than surely many other documents. Humanity exists within nature, and all life depends on the integrity of the biosphere and the interdependence of ecological systems. Similarly, next a paragraph of the preamble, and then principle 4, ecological sustainability and resilience. Legal and other measures shall be taken to protect and restore ecosystem integrity and to sustain and enhance the resilience of social ecological systems. Next, the most current example, some of us are involved in the drafting of a global pact on the environment that the French government has initiated a few months ago. The fate of this document so far has been officially been presented to the press in June in Paris by President Macron. It will go to the United Nations, presumably in December this year. In the meantime, IUCN has a chance to contribute to the further drafting. and that in my capacity as chair of the ethics specialist group, I am having a role to play there, but also my own private capacity. I'm involved in the drafting process. So we managed to get some language in here, but we are not entirely happy with it. So it's it's a work under construction. You have to appreciate that this is very much a positivistic approach by the French government. The overall aim seems to be to find a document that any state, including even the US, might be able to sign up to. So it's a little bit of a juggle between state-of-the-art thinking, what states ought to be understanding, and acknowledging the so-called reality of what states are likely to accept. So these are your examples that give you some feeling of how widespread the notion of ecological integrity in current international treaty really is. Next. Yes, this is a summarizing overview of where the notion appears in a number of jurisdictions, of course famously starting in Canada with this national park legislation from 2000, where the concept of eco integrity is very well defined, and it's been further defined in guidelines and being presented by an advisory board to the Minister for the Environment of Canada. Unfortunately no longer exists. I think it was Prime Minister Harper who sort of lost interest in it. Australia had similar attempts, New Zealand, Brazil, and other countries, usually in conservation legislation, where you have the central reference to eco integrity as a subject of any conservation efforts. Next. So we could say that ecological integrity is also a central part of ecosystem approaches to environmental law and management in the area of water and ocean protection, climate, and so on. So there's a lot of sporadic or sketchy evidence. A number of jurisdictions do refer to eco integrity, others not. We still have a lack of proper understanding how widespread this has been. How widespread the use has actually been in various jurisdictions. I'll give you one quick example where it has worked very well. That's New Zealand. Next. What's next? The Resource Management Act in New Zealand. I won't go into details, but fundamentally the word wire suggests that those kind of activities will, for the benefit of social, economic, and cultural well-being, will only be can only be justified insofar as they are not in any way jeopardizing the needs of future generations, or in any way compromising the life supporting capacity of ecosystems. So what follows here under ABC are really the preconditions under which any action has to be assessed, so-called environmental bottom lines. Next. This has been followed by the New Zealand court initially as the environmental bottom lines approach. Next, but then incrementally being given up. Politics came in the way, and there was a certain replacement by the so-called overall judgment approach, which is really more of the same, that a judge typically, as they approach things, find the right balance between the conflicting interests, economic, social, environmental factors. Contra legem, I might add, as the Supreme Court for New Zealand has suggested quite recently. Next, in the famous Supreme Court course called King's Sermon, the environmental bottom line approach was seen as the more truthful one to the act. And ever since, next, we are on the track, hopefully, back to the real meaning of sustainable development or sustainable management, namely ecological sustainability to be paramount. So the strong sustainability model. Next, my concluding remarks. What can environmental lawyers do now? It's a very clear proposition. We need to promote this, what I consider to be the Grundnorm in environmental law, powerfully. There are many ways to do it by usual academic work, but we are lucky enough to have some indirect or direct support from many colleagues from around the world through the adoption of the Oslo Manifesto that Massimiliano and I were guilty of in presenting to the Oslo meeting of the IUCN Academy of Environmental Law in June last year. So the Oslo Manifesto was, of course, a triggering point for next for this. You realize I'm hoarse, my voice is leaving me. probably because of the excitement of the last week. The launching of ELGA has been such a joy and such a tremendous success. Thanks to the host, Massimiliano, I want to acknowledge here the spirit of the place. Siena was amazing. And most importantly, contributions of colleagues and friends of all of those who were present and others who presented from far afield. So, to wrap up, next, this is really what I believe. To quote a famous Maori princess from New Zealand, Te Poa Herangi, if I dream alone. If we dream as a collective, we can achieve our dream. So, next, please. And this is the end of it. Hopefully clear, straightforward message, but open, of course, to question and debate. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Klaus, for a presentation that really spans the scope of our 2 days' work here. We'll indulge, as Jeff has suggested, in as much question and comment our audience, our attendance feels it has this morning. So the floor is open.
Thank you so much for making time for this in such a tight schedule in a VIP room in an airport. That's sort of above and beyond. But we certainly would have missed something special if you hadn't been part of this. And congratulations on the ELGA launch. That really was a great step forward.
Let me say, you are a part of this, Jeff. You yourself, of course, and the whole preparation. So congratulations to everybody who didn't happen to be in Siena, but of course you're there now.
Thank you, Klaus. So I guess I'm going to force the problem question back in here. You know, you mentioned some things like the future we want, and I think I heard you say that it was an especially weak document. I certainly agree with that. And the sustainable development goals and so many of the things associated with sustainable development have, I mean, what in 1992 was sustainable development is sort of turned into sustained economic growth. So that seems to be a core of one of the problems we have to grapple with, and I wonder what your thoughts are on that. And then the second question is really, what should we be doing to work together to define what ecological integrity means, to give proper role for human society in the global ecosystem? Humans as part of that ecosystem rather than its masters and controllers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jeff. So 2 parts. As for the first, the famous Sustainable Development Discourse, I would take a rather pragmatic approach by saying it's too early to tell whether this kind of concept has completely failed or whether it's still open and still be capable to be further developed. Of course, the plan is that the SDGs that you refer to are on their way, and they will be reviewed in 2020. 2020 is a incredibly important year. So what I've gathered from the UN context, so many things are culminating there. In our context here, SDGs, there will be a review of the implementation process. So it's an opportunity there to influence the decision making. There's also a political body called the High Political Forum, which is under review. And some of you may recall that recently we had a chance to talk at the United Nations General Assembly, and of course Peter was there, Peter Brown was there, and there was an opportunity to bring forward some new ideas, and the idea put forward on behalf of a number of groups, including hopefully ELGA, is to call for the United Nations to give the SDG process a coherent ethical framework. And the best way to do it is by the establishment of an Earth Trusteeship Council to revive a tradition of the United Nations that began many, many years ago and has never been completed. But I feel there's a sentiment for taking the next step and holding states accountable for taking a trusteeship responsibility for natural resources along with the United Nations. So these are just ideas at the moment, but they seem to be getting traction. A number of countries have indicated their support. The G77 group under the leadership of Ecuador hopefully will. So there's a certain road, or let's call it roadmap, that can give sustainable development some clout and meaning along the lines of promoting trusteeship concepts, which also is an attempt to answer your second aspect, Jeff, regarding the eco-integrity concept, how it can manifest itself. Of course, it leads to the strong sustainability approach, thereby requiring that the environment actually has a voice and not just being considered as one of many factors. Currently, the environment has no voice. I might add, recently in some jurisdictions, including New Zealand, it is beginning to have a voice. You will be aware of the river rights in New Zealand and some court decisions in India, Costa Rica, suggesting, in fact, the need and the possibility that natural subjects can have intrinsic rights and can have own rights that need to be represented by people. So I think these two sort of examples I find in the context of ERGA, of our pursuits to be a platform, a unifying body for so many good environmental, ecological law groups around the world. This gives us a lot to do for the future.
Peter Brown, thank you very much for that history of the concept and reminding us of its really true integrity and a lot of historical momentum behind it. The problem is that this discourse, very important and well-grounded, is still nearly 100% captured or marginalized by the main story, which is economic growth. And so how are kind of if you're a tractor convertible, kept in the garage, right? Well, the main traffic's going by on the street. How are you going to be able to? How are we going to be able to basically turn the tables on that game?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I'm not sure whether I heard you in all details, but I take it the relationship between sustainability and growth, economic growth, of course, you're referring to, and how we can sort of reconcile the two. My take would be to start with this jargon. I would not necessarily want to refer to degrowth per se. Of course, there's a strong degrowth movement. I think for tactical reasons to talk about a growth, citing Bruno Latour from France, who said, well, we should really conduct our sustainability course regardless of any growth agenda. Ideally, I would envisage that these growth people and this ongoing debate about growth, non-growth, or qualitative growth, growth in the south, growth in the north, if we can, as much as we can possibly do it, leave this aside and rather say about the sustainability discourse, just in the tradition of the Club of Rome, was all about finding an antithesis and competing model to the growth paradigm. We're talking about paradigm clashes here. I know it's not a very satisfactory answer. I'm not an economist. You're far more advanced and far more knowledgeable about this. But my feeling is these sort of dichotomy, growth, yes, no, doesn't get us very far. We should rather sort of insist on sustainability. It has an implication of certain things can grow, right, and others can't. Obviously, there's the limits of the planet where material growth can not occur. There's population issues. But how about growing knowledge, growing spirituality? I'm sure you and I and all the others, we have very similar ideas here. But I see definitely a correlation of the sustainability and sustainable development discourse and the growth discourse. And I would like to think that our arguments are stronger, that we should insist that sustainability is a central reference point and not so much the question whether growth or no growth are acceptable for the time being. So that's my take. And I'm afraid I need to wrap up for my part here. I'm just hearing some voices telling it's about time to get on our plane here. So perhaps another question or remark, otherwise I would on my end say goodbye.
Klaus, I think we do have to move along here with our program, but we're so thankful that you that you made time just before you get on that flight. So hope it's a good one.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Just a short flight to Frankfurt. Yeah. thank you very much, and sorry that I can't be with you, but I'm delighted to be with you in this way. Bye-bye.